afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of Lessons to Leadership. I've got the pleasure of Ben Brown joining me today. I won't do the introductions myself, but Ben, welcome. If you'd like to just give a bit of an intro to yourself and tell us about you.
Perfect. No, well, thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm Ben Brown, currently the CTO at an insurtech called Flock. Actually been there about 8 weeks, so actually still pretty new into the role. I'd say been an engineering leader probably for the best part of 10 to 15 years now. Started out very much as an engineer, typical computer science background, and kind of found my way in the position I am today.
Awesome, thank you. Well, yeah, looking forward to unpacking that a bit. So, in the theme of Lessons to Leadership, tell us a little bit more about your leadership journey specifically and how you found your way into the role you are now.
Sure. So, I said it earlier, I was very much from an engineering background, did computer science at university, and found myself as a kind of a programmer and engineer once I graduated. I'd say the first few years of my career was very happy to just be an engineer, just kind of knocking out some code, delivering some value on a day-to-day basis, and kind of was having a great time. Probably about maybe 5-6 years into my career, I started to take up much more of a kind of tech leadership position, so getting asked to drive a little bit more of kind of initiatives and be a kind of a bit more of somebody who sets the kind of architecture out and sets the vision for the platform out. And at that sort of time, there was a dev manager working with me, somebody who did the kind of people side of the role, did very much more of that aspect of things. And he actually emigrated to Australia. And a little bit at that point in time, the kind of my leader at that point, a guy called Des, he said to me, so Ben, you're probably going to go on this journey at some point to leadership. We've just lost Craig. He's gone over to Australia. I've kind of debated whether this is the right time to have this conversation with you, but would you like to give it a go? Would you like to try this kind of people leadership style of things? He very much kind of gave me a bit of feedback at that stage, and we can certainly talk about that later through the podcast of what I needed to do differently, perhaps to what I was doing at the moment. But he also then kind of said, well, look, I believe in you. I know you'll get there. And ultimately, that's what kind of led me into those first stages of leadership.
Nice. Sounds like kind of the opportunity at the right time, but
yeah.
With some kind of guidance from Craig, I think you said there as well.
From Des, yeah.
From Des. You mentioned there about kind of there was some kind of quite open feedback. I mean, tell us a bit more about that. What specifically did Des say then? What weren't you doing? What were you doing? And what helped you kind of make that move?
Yeah, certainly. So he gave me one of the most, I guess, impactful bits of feedback I've ever had, and that was really that so far in your career, you've really been paid for your IQ, your ability to solve problems, and those problems have generally been logic. They've been build me this thing, solve me this problem. And he said, well, look, you could continue down that path for the rest of your career, doing the IQ thing, or if you move down this people route, what I'm really going to ask you to solve are people problems. And that's going to be far more about your EQ, your emotional intelligence, and how you tackle the problems in that manner. And so that was probably at that stage, my first introduction to EQ, and I'd never really kind of learned that much about it. I'd been probably most of the reading I would do outside work would be on technologies. It would be learning the next greatest thing to kind of programming. And that started to open my eyes to this concept of EQ and what that meant. I'd love to say it was an easy journey. I think the first couple of years, if you were a fly on the wall watching me be a leader, you would definitely be giving me plenty of feedback about how not to do things and how I perhaps made mistakes along.
Give a little bit of an example of like those skills, so IQ versus EQ.
Yeah. So the IQ skill set is very much around, I guess, getting the right answer intellectually. So you could probably see this coming out in more problems like math problems, computer science problems, those sorts of things. Build me the best algorithm to do this thing might be a good kind of IQ-based problem. And generally you're looking there for, what's the most optimal kind of solution to that problem. Whereas EQ is much more about using that emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence to me, what does that mean? Well, it's very much about me being able to understand, empathize with other people, put myself in their shoes, understand why they're doing things, understand why they might tackle things in a certain way based on their personality, based on the way they see things. And then using all of that information that you've kind of picked up from those perhaps clues, because sometimes, let's be clear, people don't tell you this stuff. Sometimes they don't tell you, I'm feeling particularly angry about what you've just told me. They just act angrily towards you. Taking all those clues, taking all that information, and then using that to come up with a good answer to the problem. So I guess a typical problem might be, what's the best composition of people to make up this team to deliver this project, this piece of work?
Nice. And how do you go about developing those EQ skills? Because IQ, as you mentioned, may well be your educational background or something like that. But from an EQ side, I guess that's not necessarily something that there maybe isn't a handbook or something, or there probably are more now. How did you go about developing those skills and adding them to your kind of skill set?
Yeah, so I think developing EQ was far more difficult than developing IQ, and I think that started at school where I don't think school ever gave you a lesson on kind of how to deal with people, how to work with each other. I was a sportsman when I was young, so I used to play volleyball at quite a high level, a pretty different sport, I guess. But what that did teach me was the kind of power of things like teams. And used to have a coach when I was at the time playing for the under-19s England team. And the coach there was what some people might have thought of as a bit crazy. But what he did was things that were very different. He focused far more on the people side of our playing together as a team. Yes, he focused on the technical side, the kind of volleyball skills, but he also really focused on how do we operate together as a team. And we used to do exercises, which at the time I was kind of like, why are we doing this? What does this mean? But it made a lot more sense in later life, where everybody in the team had to go around to everybody else and tell them one thing that they admired about them and one thing that they felt they could improve. Yeah. And even that kind of very basic thing was like, oh, okay, so this makes a difference. Now, I'd love to say at that point in my life I knew exactly what this meant. I didn't. I was kind of like, okay, well, this is interesting. Let me give it a try. Let me see how this works. But I think as I got older, as I got a bit more experienced, I realized that in general, learning EQ is probably similar to IQ in a sense. You just need to practice. Yeah. You just need to give this more of a go on a regular basis. Yeah. Because ultimately it is a skill. I think it is a muscle. I think if you'd met Ben when I was just the programmer, you might have said, "Hey, this guy's got very little emotional intelligence," but hopefully over time I've built a little bit more than that.
Yeah, England under-19s volleyball. That's pretty cool.
It was an interesting. I would. We definitely did not have the glamorous lifestyle, is what I would say.
Nice. What does leadership mean to you, and how has your definition of leadership evolved or changed over the years?
Yeah. So leadership. What does it mean to me? I think it's something I think about a lot. I guess what's my role in an organisation? Why do I exist? What's the role of a leader? I think in the early days, I probably saw this as as I was perhaps managing individual contributors as in one-to-ones. I probably saw this much more about, I guess, just getting things done and being the coordinator, being the person to perhaps bring things together. I think over time, as I stepped into more senior leadership roles and managed other managers, what I really realized was that my role is something quite different. And what I tried to do over the last couple of years was have a think about what my mission was. Why do I exist as a leader? And I think one of the things that I came up with was this idea that my reason for existence in an organization is really to create that environment where other people can do the best work of their lives. And if I do that as a leader, then we'll be a successful organization, because those people will be doing the best work of their lives. And if everybody can do the best work of their lives, wouldn't that be an amazing place for us all to work? So I realized over time that was a kind of the end game of where I got to and how I'd kind of learned these things. I think that the role of a leader is something that keeps changing. I think it keeps evolving. I think it can depend very heavily on the team you're leading at that point in time. Sometimes teams are going through really great times, and all your job as a leader is to kind of keep that momentum going and kind of keep them moving. Other times teams are going through some really challenging times, and actually your job can be the the inputter of energy or the person to bring motivation to the team. And so I think, part of that emotional intelligence that we talked about before is really understanding that and understanding what role you have to play within a team at a moment in time.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I would assume that your role as a leader will somewhat change depending on what the company's goals and vision is, and then you need to try and, I guess, merge your mission with the company's vision as well, depending on whether you're looking to achieve next round of funding, whether you deliver a product or something like that.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. So before my current role, I used to work for an electric vehicle subscription service called Onto. So unfortunately, Onto with other peers there. As I realised during that kind of perhaps last 9 months of my time there at Onto, it was much more about, unfortunately, consolidation. So challenging times led us to having significant cash problems. We had to go through a round of redundancies back in March and April, and I think my time there was to ultimately make sure that we looked after each and every person that had to leave our business on that time. And I think emotionally that was a very tough time for me, but it was the right thing to do for everybody there and make sure that they were as looked after as well as we could do in as transparent a way as possible through that process. Then over the next probably 4 to 5 months, unfortunately, things continued to get worse, and unfortunately, my role there was probably then far more about keeping people motivated, getting us back to an operating model that we were comfortable with again, because ultimately we'd been through a lot of change. And then I probably went another switch again as we got to the last few weeks of my time there, in which case it was, by that point in time, I think we knew that the writing was on the wall, and then it was probably again about being a transparent leader and helping each person to move on from that and know what their next step should be. So motivating them to think about those next steps. Perhaps you should be preparing a CV, perhaps you should be thinking about where your next stage of that journey is, because things might not work out here, and this might be something that that's the best way I can help you to do that best work at this point in time. So I'd say very heavily dependent on your time, your company, your strategy at that point in time.
Yeah, it sounds like, as you said before, like your kind of role as a leader, again, very much to kind of understand what your personal mission is. And it sounds like you as a leader have kind of tried to always be as transparent as possible, as you said, even if unfortunately the times like Onto aren't necessarily as positive. Being that transparent leader and saying kind of, look, maybe this is the right route or this is the right route. Would you say that transparency is kind of a quality or a characteristic has been kind of something you've always tried to be as a leader and important to you?
Yeah, so transparency is definitely a very important thing for me, as is kind of authenticity, I think, which goes alongside transparency. Things are not always going to be great. I think in reality, most people understand that. Most pragmatic human beings kind of get this piece. But I think as long as you're able to take people on that journey, treat them fairly, treat them with a transparent, give them as much information as you possibly can, then I think that's what most people would see as, okay, this person's been fair to me, they've done the right thing. I think this can happen in difficult situations with a company. It can happen when unfortunately I've been in situations where perhaps people have been underperforming in a team. I think that's another scenario where ultimately this thing's going to come to a head at some point. The best thing I can do is be very transparent with this person, help them understand the challenges, help them understand where perhaps things aren't working, give them as much opportunity and support to come through that as possible. And if that doesn't work, it doesn't work. But hopefully it does. Hopefully it kind of moves them in the right direction. And if not, at least they part ways saying, well, that was a great place to work. I really enjoyed that. And I do think that your goal as a leader should also be to leave that organisation in a much better place as you kind of move through it.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about kind of your personal mission and creating the environment that allows people to achieve their best work. What happens if the people who work there, that isn't their mission? Because some people just turn up to work and want to kind of do their work and get out. What happens and how do you change your position as a leader if people aren't necessarily on the same journey as you, or they don't have the same mission?
Yeah, I think the important thing about that mission for me is that it's their best work of their lives.
Yeah.
And, I think that will probably kind of change for people, and it'll probably be different for people. But I think this is where the kind of emotional intelligence and the empathy comes in, because it is about finding something that works for them.
Yeah.
I think it would be impossible to say that everybody who works for you is going to be 100% motivated 100% of the time.
Yeah.
Everybody goes through difficult times, everybody goes through great times in their lives, and you need to help people go through that. And I think the role that I can play as a leader through perhaps some of the more difficult times is, first of all, again, showing that empathy and understanding for them, communicating that with them. If they've lost somebody or recently gone through family problems, I try to make a strong example of saying, I'm really sorry that this has happened. I can't understand what you're going through, but please come and tell me what you need, because ultimately I can't read your mind, but if you can help me to understand what you need, then I can perhaps help you to kind of work through this situation. So I do think it is about, I say, that empathy. It's about understanding how we get the best out of each and every person and changing that over time.
What are some of the key qualities or characteristics that you believe effective leaders should have?
Yeah, so I think there's a few characteristics that effective leaders should have. We talked a little bit earlier around things like transparency and authenticity, but to build on that, perhaps I'll share another couple as well. I think the first one I'd like to share is definitely around the empathy piece. Empathy is a difficult thing. I think I see a lot of misunderstandings, especially in my perhaps more junior people in the team, of what empathy truly is. Empathy is putting yourself in that person's shoes. It's feeling what they're feeling. It's experiencing what they're experiencing as much as you can do to really understand where they're coming from with what they say. I've seen a lot of people say they're very empathetic and then perhaps just go, but I really don't understand why that person's behaving that way. Well, that's quite hard to say. If you're truly being empathetic, then perhaps you should think a bit harder, think a bit differently about why that person might be feeling that way. I think a second one to perhaps touch on, is something we talk about in the industry called servant leadership. What is servant leadership? I think it's very much about being there in service of that team, of the people there to help them get things done. Ultimately, the way I get more done in my current role at Flock is not to do more stuff myself. It's to enable my team to do more. And that could be by unblocking the bigger things. It could be by helping to set vision and direction that they need in the future. It could just be by solving some really small things that are getting in people's way. It doesn't have to always be the big things. But my role there is to ultimately get the most out of those people, and I only do that by being that servant to them.
Nice. You mentioned earlier as well, kind of 2 points around transparency and authenticity as well. Tell us a little bit more about those and how you feel those qualities benefit being a good leader.
Yeah, so transparency is, I think, an important characteristic, because I think people are more likely to be supportive and work with a transparent leader. They understand they're getting the information, they understand that person is being open and honest with them. I think this comes out most during the difficult times. I think it's easy to be transparent during the highs of life, because people can always share great news, always share the best of times with others. I think where it's most difficult is probably in the more difficult times, where being transparent is hard. It can be difficult to know what to say. But I think that's it is very important that we try to help people understand what is really going on, why it's really going on. Now, there'll always be confidential information in companies, but there'll always be ways of explaining things to people that take them along for that journey. Sometimes without telling them exactly what's going on, but it does mean that they know that they're going in the right direction.
Yeah. Nice. And a lot of those there, to me, are kind of more on that EQ side of things. So a question in the kind of theme of the podcast, Lessons to Leadership, when you're working with your teams and you're trying to identify future leaders, are those still attributes that you look for in those people, or are there other skills, attributes, qualities that maybe senior engineers or people have that you think actually they could be a really good leader?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a few areas that I'd say make me think this person is somebody that I would look to being a future leader in my team. I think the first one is perhaps a curiosity for the kind of people side of it.
Yeah.
So they might start by asking questions. Well, why does so and so behave like this, or why does this happen, or how do we get better at being a team? That sort of curiosity, I think that natural curiosity makes me realize that person cares about this stuff and really wants to, really wants to explore it a little bit more. Whereas, I've certainly seen the engineers who want to stay on that engineering track be quite curious about what's the latest and greatest technology or this side of things, and perhaps not be quite so interested in, well, why is my team not working as efficiently as possible? I think another quality that's really important that I often look out for is, one of the important things for me in leadership is really you should listen more than you should talk.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, often hard. It's far easier to talk in most cases. For me, probably takes far less effort to talk than it does to listen. But it's really is one of those things where I'm kind of looking at people and saying, does this person listen? Does this person think about what they're hearing? Do they ask good questions, which I think is another one of the aspects to there, because are they trying to understand this stuff better and trying to get there, or are they just trying to be right? Are they just trying to have the right answer to this conversation? They don't really care how we get there, which might demonstrate that actually this person needs a little bit more coaching or help to kind of get to that point.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because, as you said, a lot of the points there that make a good leader are more around the EQ side, but there's actual quite fundamental aspects that you can identify with anyone that may kind of make them better leaders, or at least kind of get them on that journey to being a better leader.
Yeah.
How important is self-awareness in leadership, and what strategies can leaders use to try and improve that self-awareness? Yeah,
so I think firstly, self-awareness is amazingly important for leaders. I think the challenge of being a leader is often that the more senior you get, the less feedback you get from other people. The less willing people are to tell you what's going wrong or what's perhaps not working very well. And while I try and surround myself by people who are willing to give feedback to even somebody more senior themselves, I think it's really important that you look at the stuff you're doing, the actions you're taking, the way you're doing things, and that you are critical with yourself about when things are going well and when actually you could be doing better. And I think that comes from that self-awareness. In terms of how you kind of improve that or make that better, I think it's, again, a practicing piece. I think taking conscious time to look at feedback, conscious time to ask yourself where you, perhaps in the last week I did some amazing things, and where actually did I do things that I would love to have done differently. I think there's almost like a mental practice of things sometimes, of thinking about these things. Why did I approach that this way? Could I have approached that a different way? How might have that played out differently? I think practice is, generally a very important thing to do with these sorts of things, but is, particularly challenging with something like self-awareness, because how does the non-self-aware person practice something they don't even know exists? Yeah. I think a second point is probably find some good mentors, if you can. Find somebody who is willing to tell you the things that might be wrong, or is willing to at least challenge you and coach you in those areas, even if they're just asking the questions, hey, why did that conversation go particularly badly when you expected it to go really well? They're at least challenging you to think about those things, and that can be the kind of reminder and the way of kind of making up for not being self-aware yourself. Yeah, I think that's 2 points there really interesting. Completely agree. I think it's quite difficult when you become CTO or potentially kind of the top of the tree in regards to that engineering org to kind of get the feedback that you want, and I guess maybe even be able to kind of trust in that feedback that it is authentic. So your kind of advice there is try and kind of surround yourself with as many people and create kind of an environment that allows kind of quite open feedback. But also the mentor thing is really interesting. Where do you find those people? Is there kind of networks that you're part of? Like where could someone go that's listening to this go and say, cool, I need a mentor. Where can I find one? Yeah, I mean, I think that's really hard. I think mentorship is, authentic mentorship for me is about finding somebody you can connect with and can kind of share something on a same level for a long period of time. So I mentioned in one of the earlier conversations a guy called Des, who's probably the guy who helped me to become a leader in the early days.
Yeah.
I'd say me and Des probably connect very much on on the same level because we've been through a lot together, because he helped me to go through those things, because he knows me.
Yeah.
And so I've seen Des as somebody that, we don't work together anymore. We perhaps don't even see each other as much as we would like to on a regular basis. But when we do see each other, I always feel like he's somebody who's going to give it me pretty straight.
Yeah.
He knows me, he knows the way I think, and if I tell him something, he's probably going to tell me, this is the way that Ben might be seeing it, and actually this is the way it might be meant, or this is the way it might be playing out. And I think finding somebody like that is hard. I think you can do that by meeting people, you can do that by reaching out to people, having a conversation. I've had conversations one-to-one with a few people who you kind of think might be a mentor, and then you realize when you have that conversation, just the chemistry's not there. It's not something that works. That either we're misaligned in terms of what we're looking to get out of this, or actually that person's not the right person. I think there's a ripe industry out there around coaching, and clearly you can pay for some of these things. And it's something that I've dabbled with a little bit in my career, is trying an external coach to kind of work with on certain things like this. But the ideal mentor would be somebody who understands the context as well, so can hear what you're saying and see what's happening. That's the ideal for me.
Nice. So it's kind of more about finding someone that I guess you connect with probably more, not just a personal level, but actually understands you, as opposed to, they don't necessarily have to be, the best CTO.
Yeah.
Could a mentor be someone that isn't necessarily tech related and more just leadership in general?
I think they definitely can. I think you've probably got to accept they're going to be more powerful in certain areas than others. If you bring them a technical problem or ask them what the best way of solving this technical problem is, they're probably not going to be the strongest person to kind of give you the answer there. But they should be able to, a good leader I believe in any kind of discipline will hear what leadership is like, what you're doing, and will be able to kind of provide some feedback.
Nice. And we've covered it a couple of times in this already, but empathy seems like something that's kind of pretty important to you. What role does empathy play in being an effective leader?
Yeah, so I think empathy is a foundational element of being an effective leader. Being able to understand other people, being able to think about how they might be experiencing things, why they might be behaving in certain ways, allows you to be much more successful in terms of the way you tackle some of the challenges that you get with people. I think I hinted at earlier, you can often ask people why they're behaving a certain way or what's going on or those sorts of things, but sometimes you won't get the answer that you expect. So being able to perhaps think about that a little bit more, understand them, try to really get into their shoes is one way that I try to understand them a little bit better, try to work out what's going on.
Nice. And in regards to trying to kind of cultivate that empathy, are there any kind of tools or tactics or kind of anything that you do or have done in the past to really try and cultivate that within the team?
Yeah, so I think we talked a lot about practice, I think, throughout this podcast, and practice is important. Now, I think some of the things that I've done to highlight this in my teams in the past is I'm a big kind of believer in things like understanding how other people tick.
Yeah.
So over my career, I've done a few things like disc profiling, where you understand kind of the profiling of people, HBDI, which is whole brain thinking approach. And one of the things I've done with a lot of my teams is take them through that process of getting their own profile, and then also having conversations with people who've got different profiles. And that often gives them a common language, which they can then talk about things. So how might if we talk about HBDI, it has 4 colours, how might a yellow person behave in this particular scenario? Or how do you think we might make this message we're trying to give here more relevant to a green person?
Yeah.
And I really like the fact that gives them that language, it gives them that common way of talking about it, and then it somehow makes practice a little bit easier.
Yeah.
Because they can also kind of take it a little bit away. Now, you always have to be careful. I think there's sometimes that people will take that as like, well, every green person must behave this way, and that's the way it works. And that's not what these models do. But it is a way of kind of, starting the conversation, getting some kind of baselines and helping them to work through.
Yeah, I think those are really interesting. My last company, we did something similar where, it was like red, green, yellow, blue,
Yep.
I think it was. And you assumed a lot of the time that, that person, they are very like this, so they must be a red, for example.
Yep.
But actually on the question, they did come up and they were maybe more yellow. So I actually think that those can be really useful. But again, like you said there, the practice sometimes is to try and mould people into be, if everyone's one colour, then everyone will get along.
Yep.
But I think it's more understanding, this person will interact this way and this person this way, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But I think they're really interesting. And kind of moving more into kind of any other skills. So we've talked about like empathy there, we've talked about self-awareness, transparency, authenticity. Are there any other kind of values or characteristics, but kind of before we move on, that you think are imperative to kind of being a good leader?
I think they probably cover the main areas. I think we talked about one earlier, which was listening.
Yeah.
For me, as I said earlier, you should be able to listen more than you speak. That is a challenge for most people. There's the saying, you've got two ears and one mouth for a reason, and I think that's kind of what I'd like to remind myself. So I think that's it's a key skill for people. I think the second skill we've talked about is asking questions.
Yeah.
So I try to approach most of my conversations, and maybe this frustrates some of my team sometimes, but I try to approach most of my conversations by asking questions rather than making statements.
Yeah.
So I think what you've just said is wrong, but hey, help me understand that a little bit better.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that comes across, first of all, as a little bit less intense to that person. It's a little bit more welcoming to them to kind of hear that. It opens them up to kind of make a comment back. And it hopefully helps you to gain a bit more empathy from them, because you're asking questions about the thing, not just making a statement and saying, well, I'm going to stick to my own views. So I'd say, asking questions and that listening piece is a key skills that I've had to kind of work on throughout my career.
Nice, and I think those are really interesting ones, because actually all of those are kind of characteristics or kind of ways that you can be without actually being a leader, and actually you can start to work on them before you kind of move into like an official leadership role.
Certainly can.
Can you share a leadership success story from your career and kind of try to jump into a bit of the lessons that you learned from that?
Yeah, certainly. So I think what I'd love to focus in on today is I spent about 2.5 years at a company called Onto. Onto is an electric vehicle subscription service. And during the first kind of 2 years of that role, my goal was to build and scale an engineering, a product, a design, an IT, and a data team. So across those 5 different facets. I started there when the team was about 12 people. There was no structure in place. There was no kind of ways of working. It was 12 people building some code, working really hard, doing amazing things. But ultimately, they needed some help to kind of, I guess, professionalize what was being done. So I spent probably the first part of the first 12 to 18 months was heavily focused around hiring, me bringing in the right people. The goal over that first couple of years was to grow that team from about 12 people to about 55 people. So it's quite a big growth in quite a short space of time. And I knew the only way that I was going to achieve that was getting the right leaders in place below me who could then continue hiring with the same kind of values fit that we were looking for, with the same type of people that we wanted to bring into the organization. And to bring in people that really truly kind of aligned with the way that we were going to do things as an organization. That doesn't mean we all needed to be the same, and I'd like to think that we created a leadership team there who were all very different people, but ultimately we aligned around that purpose of what we wanted to do. So after kind of 12 to 18 months, I'd built the team, I'd brought the leaders on board. We probably got into maybe 18, 20 months into that process, and once a month I used to bring my leadership team together and we'd spend a day working through particular challenges we were looking at. So we'd spend some of that day a little bit more socially and some of that day trying to work through particular focus areas or priorities that we had at that moment in time. And it was during one of those sessions where a discussion was happening. And what I realized was that discussion was happening totally without me taking part.
Yeah.
And I could just sit there. I could look around the table. There was probably 7, 8 people in the room at that point. And I could look around with immense pride at the team that was there and the way that they were operating and the kind of care and passion they were putting into things. And that was just the most amazing feeling for me. And, it was during that time where I looked at that kind of personal mission, that create the environment where people can do the best work of their lives. And that was, where I realized that was actually what my purpose in life was to do for these people. And I realized then that was an absolutely amazing team. And, now I don't work with them, miss working with that team anymore, frankly. And, it was definitely one of my high points.
Nice. Yeah, it sounds like an awesome journey. So scaling a business or a team from 15 to about 55, you said, that's some feat. And I'm sure there's going to be people kind of listening or watching that would like to unpack that. That's probably a podcast in itself. What were some of the challenges, one or two, that presented, and how did you overcome those?
So I think let's talk about a couple of different areas. So I think speed is a challenge for most kind of startup scale-ups. Not only did they want to scale the team, we also wanted to launch in a different country. We also want to do loads of stuff on our current platform. So there was loads of stuff going on. So I think that kind of speed piece is definitely one of the areas that was a massive challenge. I think how do we start to overcome that? I think first of all, starting to get the right people in place.
Yeah.
Things could go faster when we had the right people in place. I definitely found that when we started to hire more of the kind of my heads of that came in and then started leading those different teams, I could leave them to get on with things, and suddenly speed was multiplied. I think it was really important for us to regularly synchronize together, get an understanding of the current direction we were working in, because I was really keen that we didn't have people pulling in different directions. And really interestingly, because I looked after both kind of the engineering side and the product side in that organization, I'd seen that friction occur in previous organizations between those two teams and wanted to make sure we didn't have the same problems that came up there.
And when you talked about getting the heads of in place, I think that's probably one of the most important pieces of that journey for you. I'm interested to understand, as a leader yourself who has your methodology around leadership, do you try and hire people that are the same as you, or do you try and hire people that are different to complement where areas that you don't have? What's the kind of blend there?
Yeah, so I think the ideal answer is I want people who our values align with the way that we think about things, but ultimately are open to challenge and think differently.
Okay, nice.
And some of this is built up with some of the people that I work with in that team were people I'd worked with before.
Yeah.
So I knew that they kind of filled those facets. They were happy to have a debate or to challenge where they felt things needed to change, but they also directionally they wanted to be in the same place. They wanted to do the same things. I think some of my strongest people in that team were definitely the ones who were happy to give me feedback, were happy to tell us when things were going wrong, were happy to kind of have those conversations. And it definitely isn't the same people that are gonna give you that. I don't think that necessarily means that my life was always easy, because things get challenging sometimes when that's the case. But I think you have to accept that as, if I want to truly have the best team possible, we're going to have to work through some of these challenges, work through the differences of opinion, and get to ultimately those outcomes that we need to.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you mentioned that kind of the moment of realization that you'd done a good job as when you were sat in that room. That kind of sounds a little bit like the mission and the goal there was to almost make yourself redundant in a situation where, I've now built this team, they're self-sufficient, and I don't need to be involved. Is that, with your journey with Flock now and things like that, is that the end goal for you ultimately? Because I can imagine that lots of leaders, especially in the economic climate and things like that, want to hold on to all of that because there may well be some concern or worry that, well, if I build a team that don't need me, where's my space? How do you feel about that, and kind of what's your thought?
Yeah, so I've always found that people who make themselves redundant to a certain extent are never without a job.
Yes.
It's how I've always found it. And I've genuinely always coached this into the people that I've led. Now, I think that's been good for me so far in my career.
Yeah.
I've not led myself down the garden path of finding myself redundant because I've done myself out of a job. But I really do think that if you think like that, you're always thinking about the next level, you're always thinking about scale, then people will always want a person that can do that. I think it's It's the person who makes themselves a subject matter expert in a certain area where people are always going, but what about this person? What happens if that person leaves? How do we cope? What's going on? They're the ones that cause the more challenging situations,
sure.
and ultimately a lot of effort and my job goes into trying to remove those kind of impediments of single people with all that knowledge.
Yeah, I like that. Make yourself redundant and you'll never be out of a job.
I like to think that's the case, hopefully.
On the flip side of that, can you share a leadership challenge or failure that you've experienced, and how you overcame that, or how you kind of then pivoted and were able to teach off the back of that?
Yeah, certainly. So, let me share a story from some of the earlier days of my leadership. At the time, I was working in that first team where I learned to be a leader. I was acting in this particular capacity as kind of like a pseudo product manager for a very technical team there who were building out our underlying platform. And what I was doing was every day we were going to stand up. I was kind of going as a kind of producty person there, kind of having these conversations with the team. And basically at the end of every stand up, I was telling them how we could do better.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize this at the time, but one of the guys from the team had a conversation with my manager and said, if Ben keeps doing this and telling us how we could be better and how it's all kind of not great what we're doing, nobody will ever want to work with him.
Yeah.
And I was like, so the manager came to me, said, this is what the feedback was from the team.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay. I'd never seen that way. And since then, what's been a key thing for me to remember is you need to give as much, if not more, praise, as well as also pointing out the things that need to improve.
Yeah.
And I have a leadership README file, which is kind of my document which I give to teams that I move into. So when I joined Flock, I gave everybody in the team my leadership README file and said, "This is me."
Yeah.
And to come back to some of the things, this is me transparent, showing that transparency is important. Me being authentic, showing that I am who I am.
Yeah.
And one of the things that still says to today is Ben is still working on giving as much praise as he does constructive criticism. And it is something I still think about on a regular basis and definitely still want to continue working on.
Nice. I think that's really insightful that, no matter kind of what level or how long you've been in something, there's still areas to kind of work and continue to improve. And again, kind of looping back to what you mentioned earlier about transparency and authenticity, I know for a fact if I had someone join that kind of, as a new leader or manager, and they were quite open that kind of these are my strengths here and this is what I'm working on, I know that would land extremely well. In today's rapidly changing business landscape, what are some of the most significant challenges that you as a leader faces, and how can we look to address those?
Yeah, so I think you summarised two in the actual question itself. So speed and rapidly changing. I think are the two big areas. Having worked in startup scale up world for probably the last 3.5 years now, no 2 days are the same. Everything is extremely interesting and exciting, and I wouldn't kind of turn my back on that for any reason.
Yeah.
But it does create significant challenges. It's far harder to think about that longer term strategic direction, to work to the future, to invest in those future things that will have the bigger impact in the long run, when actually that day to day just keeps going. There's just this extra. Do we focus more time on those long-term pieces to make sure that we are truly investing the time where it needs to be? I think what I've learned is having the right team in place, having people I can trust in my teams, gives me a bit more space to then step back and book some time in the diary, spend some time actually thinking about these things, writing it down, thinking about the strategic conversations we need to be having. rather than just dealing with that day to day.
Yeah.
But I do understand that there have been times, and certainly in my early days at Onto, where I just couldn't do that. There was too much going on a day-to-day basis that you just had to kind of deal with that. So prioritization, working out your way of dealing with that is extremely important. I learned from one of my leaders, a guy called Chris at Intuit. He taught me this idea of really thinking about your schedule and your calendar and how you color code your calendar. And I now color code my calendar. I now look at some of the stats that Google Calendar gives me about that. You spend X amount of hours in one-to-ones, you spent Y amount of hours doing this. And I think his point was in general that you need to be deliberate about what you want to prioritize. As long as you're deliberate about that, you're far more likely to achieve it.
We do something similar where kind of day plan right out and you number things 1 to 3 and that's the kind of priority of them, and then you also write down the amount of time it should take you, and then you've got to take, let's say, 8 hours in a day, for example, and the idea being that actually trying to delegate as much as possible, that let's say kind of this level of leadership in your business should be able to kind of take on tasks 3 and 2, for example, but exactly the same, because I think you end up spinning your wheels and actually not doing anything but being really busy whilst doing it. I think all of those are really good points. And as you said, the big thing there being kind of the speed and how things are rapidly changing, for sure. Diversity, equity and inclusion are probably some of the hottest topics right now in regards to leadership. How can you as a leader try and foster a more inclusive and diverse workplace?
Yeah, as you say, topical, and I think, let's just be clear, very difficult. And I think something that, first thing I'd say is you really have to give this a priority. Because I think it's very easy to get sidelined with everything else that's happening in your life, in work and everything like that, and you can forget about this. And I think it's really important that you kind of give that priority. When I was growing the team at Onto, when we grew from kind of 12 to 55, it was really important for me that we created a more diverse team. I inherited a team where I think we had 1 female engineer and kind of 11 male engineers at the time. Probably not dissimilar to a lot of companies out there that as they might see it. What I realized is that it's about kind of thinking about and consciously making decisions in terms of how we start to tackle this. So I was very keen at an early stage to make sure I could get in one of my senior leaders, if not more senior leaders, who were going to help me to kind of change this. So particularly looking for somebody who is more diverse. I think I achieved that in some ways. I think there was probably areas I could have done better, but it was really a conscious decision to try to go out there and do that. And that probably meant taking a little bit more of a risk. Because I could have probably in some cases gone with a candidate who might be the safe candidate, but actually wouldn't have really kind of challenged us. I think I potentially needed to give an opportunity there for somebody who I really did believe in to come in and kind of help things. I think that opportunity for somebody to see a more senior person there who they could, or multiple people in that senior team who they could identify with, who they could say, I could be this person, who could bring a diversity of thought to the team, is really important. I think the second thing is to come back to a few things we talked about. So we talked about empathy, we talked about transparency, and we talked about authenticity. I think it's important that those 3 things come together. And ultimately, first of all, I'm talking about creating a diverse team, and we're seeing that we're creating a diverse team and that people do genuinely see the results of that, because I could talk about it all day, and then if I ended up hiring lots of white men, that would not be a great of my actions wouldn't be kind of congruent with the outcomes we were getting. So I think it's important to make sure that we are kind of congruent with those actions. I think it's important to take people along that journey. I think there's a lot of work, you work in recruitment, there's a lot of work we can do during that recruitment process, from getting the job descriptions to be more diverse, helping people to understand their biases, to working through perhaps the more junior people in the team, or maybe the more senior people in the team, to help them understand what needs to be done to kind of create that more diverse team. But really, prioritize it, make it something that kind of happens, and I guess ultimately it succeeds or fails by my actions, because I'm ultimately responsible for that team. So I think I have to care about that enough to want to do it.
I think, as you said at the beginning, it's very topical and something that I would think every leader in the engineering space is going through at the moment. So there's topic we could kind of talk about for a whole podcast again, but no, some really good points there, thank you. How do you handle conflict within your team or organisations, and what advice do you have for leaders that are facing challenging like interpersonal dynamics at the moment?
Yeah, so I think the first thing we have to accept is that conflict is normal.
Yeah.
And probably that there's good conflict.
Yeah.
And there's probably bad conflict,
Yeah.
if we use such kind of crass terms to describe this. And really what we want to be encouraging in the team is good conflict and helping to make sure we deal with the bad conflict.
Yeah.
And I'd say the bad conflict is perhaps the things where it's, I don't know, people sniping behind each other's backs, just bad for the kind of cultural things, people not perhaps tackling these things. And good conflict is people actively challenging each other in an open environment, talking about things, trying to get to a resolution. So I think that, to come back to a few of the other things we talked about, being transparent with this, getting something out into the open. So, my general coaching, if two people are having a problem with each other, my general first conversation is with each of them one-to-one, and my general advice is they need to talk about this and try to come to some level of agreement. That can work. It can also go horrifically wrong if they're a bit more, stubborn or even inexperienced or those sorts of things. So I think, sometimes I have to then play mediator or person that comes in and helps this. And I think the way I can do that is by trying to be empathetic with both of them, trying to ask questions, trying to get them to see each other's point of view. They don't have to agree, but if they can at least understand where each other is coming from, then that's, I think, a win in that particular scenario. I think we also have to then get to a point where we understand that conflict is unhealthy and is just dragging on. So if we're still debating the same thing days, weeks later, we probably need to think about how we wrap this up, because that should not be a situation that happens, and we all need to understand that conflict is becoming unhealthy for the team. So a role I can play in that one is, I think, highlighting that, making people aware that this thing has been dragging on for a long time and accepting that we need to kind of move on. I don't like having to play the role, but occasionally you will have to be the person who makes a final decision on something. But I like to think that whenever that gets to that situation, I probably failed in my role in terms of getting the team to come to an agreement.
I like what you mentioned there about ultimately giving whoever it may be the opportunity to kind of squash it or cover it themselves, because I guess you can then potentially come across as the parent in the situation wading in and saying, right, stop, but actually giving them the opportunity. And I guess, or I would assume, the kind of seniority level will play into that actually if it's two engineering managers, you would potentially give them a little bit more space to resolve it themselves, as opposed to, let's say, if it was maybe two, mid-level engineers, for example.
Yeah, and remind them it's an opportunity to practice some of the skills we talked about. Exactly. Practice listening, practice asking some questions, practice trying to empathise with that person. Perhaps asking them to tell me what they think the other person's view is and why they think they're coming from that, to practice those skills to then hopefully help them to solve the problem.
Nice. And when we've spoken on this topic a couple of times, I had it written down here, you mentioned that there was a good book, I think it's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and there's a fear of conflict or something, something in there.
Yeah, so the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni is, I think, a classic book is what I would say. I love Patrick Lencioni books, firstly because he understands that books should be about 150 pages and should last you no more than a couple of days. So absolutely perfect there. He realises he gets paid for the book, not the word. As some authors, I think, realise they get paid. Think they get paid by the word. He has a model in 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which basically looks at the areas that a team might start to fail. Now, the bottom of the model, the bottom of the pyramid, is trust. Do the team trust each other? The second level up on that is healthy conflict. And really, a team not having healthy conflict is an unhealthy team. And they won't have healthy conflict if they don't trust each other. So how do we help them to trust each other? And that's back to the empathy piece, it's back to the understanding piece, which hopefully helps them to get to a point where they can solve that healthy conflict.
Nice. So if anyone out there is experiencing this, you'd recommend the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team book?
Give it a read. I don't think I'll be putting too much money in his pocket, because they've probably sold plenty of other books before.
Cool. How do you balance the need for results and performance against the well-being and happiness of your team?
Yeah, again, topical conversation here. Well-being and kind of performance and driving people is certainly something that a lot of people are talking about. Now, we know we've been through the kind of COVID years of people getting burned out and those sorts of things, but we're still in that world where it's challenging for a lot of people. They're still kind of feeling burned out by the world that they live in. Now, I think the important thing for me is let's focus on some of the basics. So the basics are it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to remind people that, sometimes you have to keep reinforcing that.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure I believe the whole, it's a marathon of mini sprints.
Okay.
Some people might kind of think about this. We just have to keep sprinting for 10 times on the trot and then we'll be fine.
Yeah.
The way I think of it is, well, if we sprint for a few days and we need to get this thing out, we all work in organisations where sometimes there are times that it's a particular time to get something out the door, then let's spend some time after that recovering, recuperating, getting back to normal.
Yeah.
I think the second thing is, this is a topic that we should be talking about as a team, as an organisation.
Yeah.
So if I can get to a point where people can tell me that this is something that is happening and they're feeling, then I think I've achieved that transparency and authenticity that we've talked about.
Yeah.
If I can, then I can have conversations about that with the team. As soon as I hear anything about this in the team, my first job is to start talking about it. Because I think me being open and talking about it then triggers other people to talk about it. And I've certainly worked in roles where I've felt burnt out at certain points in my career. Sometimes I've probably not handled that the best because I've been not experienced in that. And so I think if a leader can help to talk about this more, then that's the way of achieving it. Because ultimately we're playing the long game here, and what I care about is keeping somebody engrossed for the long term.
Yeah.
And back to my mission, creating that environment where they can create the best work of their lives. They're only going to do that best work if they're feeling energized, they're feeling it's the right time. They're not going to create that if they're feeling burnt out and kind of, just not into what they're doing.
Yeah, I think, like you said there, it's important to address it and not kind of be scared of it. That look, people do get burnt out, people do get stressed, and in the environments that you notoriously working in, the startup scale-ups, look, there are going to be times where people are a little bit stressed and stuff like that. But I think, like you said, being open to share your own experience and saying, look, I'm a little bit burnt out. I'm going to take the time that I need. I would have thought kind of with depending on the size of the business, being able to kind of lean and look at your people or kind of HR business as well is a good asset to have in those situations.
Definitely. And I think another aspect that's really important for me is when I go on holiday, I make sure I communicate to the team that I'm going on holiday and I'm turning off.
Yeah.
Now, if you want me, you can call me. You can perhaps WhatsApp me.
Yeah.
But I'm turning Slack off. I'm turning email off. I'm not going to respond to those. If you really need something urgent, of course I'm here and I'll speak to you. But I'm going away on holiday and I'm turning off. And I think that setting an example to people hopefully makes it easier for them to do something similar.
I think, like you said, if you build a healthy or a strong leadership group beneath you, ultimately empowering kind of maybe your more junior leaders to take on that extra responsibility and saying, cool, I'm offline. If you need me, call me. But you run the show for a week or something like that. At the end of the day, well, hopefully, depending on what business, nothing's going to kind of burn down or break too badly.
Yeah.
So actually, cool, you're in charge now, and empowering those to step up will help that.
Exactly.
Brilliant. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining me on the very first episode of Lessons to Leadership. What we will do is I'll kind of add all your details to the podcast and people can find you on LinkedIn and all sorts of things like that. But again, on the topic of leadership, a question that I'm going to be asking everyone is, who is the best leader that you have worked with and why?
Yeah, certainly. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure. And please do reach out through LinkedIn if you'd love to connect. So my idea, my kind of leader that I really respect, I think I've mentioned him a couple of times so far in this podcast, a guy called Des Matthewman. So Des is the guy that helped me to become a leader. Now, I like to think that I maybe would have done it at some point without him, but I really do think he helped me to get through that as quickly as possible. And now a lifelong friend and somebody that I consider a mentor and a friend along the way. So he would definitely be my guy.
Brilliant. Awesome. Thanks very much, Ben. Cheers.
Thank you.